She came, she saw, she scarpered.
I came into office at a time of great economic and international instability. I recognise, though, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party.
Today it's a full year since Liz Truss stood in Downing Street and promised to transform the UK's economy. For the better.
I will take action this day and action every day to make it happen.
But how did the chant of Liz for change turn to change for Liz? Today, her biographer on the twists, the U-turns and the turmoil.
Everyone I've spoken to has regret about what went on, and most of them are saying, how on earth could we have someone who we had such faith in? How did it end up so badly wrong?
You're listening to Stories of Our Times from The Times and The Sunday Times. I'm Luke Jones. Today, Liz Truss, House of Cards to House of Horrors.
I'm James Heal. I'm political correspondent at The Spectator and co-author of the Liz Truss biography Out of the Blue, the inside story of her rise and fall, with Harry Cole, who's political editor of The Sun.
And we're going to go through that downfall in slow motion detail as it happened over 45 days or 49 days?
45 was when she resigned, 49 was when she left.
Okay.
49.
But interestingly, before we get to that, you think that the seeds of her downfall were sown even before the clock started ticking?
Well, it was partly due to how she became Prime Minister, which was this really long summer leadership contest. And it was clear from about mid-August that she was going to become the next Conservative leader. And really the whole team, the inner core circle, decamped to Chevening, which is the Foreign Secretary's grace and favour country mansion. And we went along and interviewed Truss there, and it was bizarre. It was like something out of Bridgerton or some Regency drama. It's this gorgeous, I think, 17th century house in the countryside where there were people sort of dotted around in twos or threes, just waiting to take over and run the country, really. And I think in those periods, some of the mistakes were bedded in. So there were a lot of people getting involved in policy and what was going to be in the money budget and what wasn't, and also the jobs that were being divvied up for Number 10 as well. And I think the operation, which fell apart so spectacularly behind the scenes, was really conceived there.
And in that Bridgerton-style setting, as you have it, did she seem at ease, on top of things, like a woman with a mission? What was the vibe like?
I think there was a real sense of confidence there, not just from Liz Truss, but also the people around her. Was a sense of they'd waited so long for this. If you think about, Liz Truss was the longest continually serving minister, spent 10 years getting to the top. So they were really excited that this was their big moment in the sun. And when we interviewed her for the first interview for the book, she was completely at ease, very relaxed, funny. I think you saw a side to her which wasn't always evident on camera. But the danger is, of course, is perhaps that confidence did tip into complacency, as we saw a month later.
And is part of that complacency exemplified by the fact that she was willing to sit down to do an interview with some biographers before having even taken office?
I think that every Prime Minister does get these books written about them when they enter office. And I suppose they always end on a kind of cliffhanger note, because people always sort of pull their punches, don't they? Because they write, they're the coming thing, the rising star, etc. And they end on a note of, will they be great or not? And unfortunately for her, by the time we finished it, we literally stopped writing the day she left Downing Street, and the conclusion was pretty clear.
Gosh. Let's go through that then. Day 1, 6th of September. Liz Truss arrives on Downing Street. And weirdly in that setting, it's not all sunshine for her.
So Boris Johnson left that morning, that Tuesday morning, bathed in glorious sunshine, driving off. And then, unfortunately, when Liz Truss flew back down from Balmoral, having met the monarch just shortly after midday, it really was into horrible weather. And so once they landed in London, they had to drive around and extend the journey because aides in Number 10 were checking their weather apps and making sure that the Prime Minister didn't give a speech outside in the rain. She was insistent it was going to be outside on Downing Street, and they had to make sure the weather was right. So there was a sort of real delay, and lots of cameras were waiting. And so if you look at the pictures, you'll see some of the aides in the background on Downing Street look a little bedraggled because they've been waiting outside, waiting desperately for the Prime Minister to arrive.
And it actually affected the content of her speech as well.
Well, yes, there was a reference to riding out the storm.
I am confident that together we can ride out the storm. We can rebuild our economy. and we can become the modern, brilliant Britain that I know we can be.
Which is sort of slightly ironic given how half the press corps had been trying to ride out the storm that afternoon.
And she finally managed to give that speech, 5 minutes in total. What was the promises? What was the tone that she set there?
There was a deliberate decision to make it only about 5 minutes speech, I think, to try and make it really a sense of action and dynamism. Churchill, of course, talked about action this day. Truss went a step further with action every day. I think Truss and those around her wanted to symbolise how, after perhaps this kind of vacillation of elements of Boris Johnson's policy agenda, this was going to be a really determined government.
And all those plans which were being cooked up in Chevening, this was the moment at which they could start to be put into action. What kind of things did she immediately set about doing to get a grip on things?
So the first thing was the energy crisis, and bills were skyrocketing, quadrupling last autumn. And so Truss was considering putting together a big energy policy plan. And from talking to people, it seems that there was a kind of late stage escalation of that. She was like, right, we're going to go one big kind of bazooka measure, and then we can put this to bed, shut it up for a year and move on to other issues of economic agenda.
Yeah.
And that really was what happened. So we got this energy price cap, and it was what she dominated the first 2 days in office.
And especially dominated day 3. So this was now the 8th of September. She's on the floor of the House of Commons announcing that bazooka energy policy. But even as she was doing that, news started to trickle out, especially amongst those sitting in the chamber, of something a lot more consequential.
I mean, I was talking to someone who said that, the Queen, in the final appearance, which she did, which was swearing in the new Prime Minister, seemed a little frail, but no one thought anything imminent. But then on the Wednesday, she'd taken a downturn in her health. Then on Thursday morning, there came the news that the Queen was pretty ill before Truss had to go to the House and talk about the energy package.
From the 1st of October, a typical household will pay no more than £2,500 per year for each of the next 2 years while we get the energy market back on track.
So that was at the back of her mind. And then Nadhim Zahawi came in with a note for both benches, the government and the opposition, warning them basically to wind things up because the Queen was gravely ill. And then I think just after 3 o'clock that afternoon, she died. And the first thing her aides knew of it was when they saw Truss going and demanding a black dress. These are the kind of mundane details, but she'd only just moved into number 10 and didn't have all her wardrobe, and so she needed a black dress because she was going to do the speech. And this news was kind of filtering out of Westminster. I was getting messages from people within government looking quite grim. People were already looking for black ties to wear, and the news was broken shortly after 6 o'clock. And Liz Truss became the first person to utter the words publicly.
God save the King.
What was happening behind the scenes there? Because it was only a couple of days earlier on that she'd fired the most senior civil servant in the Treasury. There was a sort of mood music of we wanted to sort of bust through the civil service. And yet all of a sudden here they were having to rely on them.
Having come in, I think that Truss really wanted to shake up what happened in number 10. She wanted to shrink it. A lot of prime ministers do this. They come into number 10 and they think that it's too leaky, it's inefficient, people don't work for them. And so she really instituted a new regime. Someone put it to me, anyone who worked for Michael Gove was immediately bulleted. They got rid of a lot of people. They moved a whole kind of tier of government out of number 10 into the cabinet office. And Kwarteng was pretty insistent on the fact they wanted to get rid of Tom Scollett, permanent secretary of the Treasury, who was seen by some people around Truss as kind of the embodiment of the Treasury orthodoxy and the blob way of thinking. So there was a lot of this stuff going on. But then when the Queen dies, it's Operation London Bridge kicks into action, and suddenly politics shuts down for best part of 2 weeks. And it's the official mourning period. You can't do any policy announcements. No ministers are going on broadcast rounds. So it's suddenly the civil service machine dictating what's going on in the country. And everyone was at a bit of a loss. And I think that did feed into that sense of imperialism, which Truss had a whole winning streak. The energy package, she got away with it. She won the Tory leadership. She had a whole series of things building up, and I think that fueled some of the overexcitement in the mini budget.
Which happened on day 17 after that period of mournings. This is Friday the 23rd of September. Prime Minister's keen to get back to business. Chancellor Kwarteng delivers a budget. This was the defining event of the premiership, wasn't it? How this unravelled.
I think you need to step back a sec and remember that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng had entered Parliament on the same day in 2010. They'd been long-standing allies. They'd worked together on pamphlets at the free market think tank, the IEA. They'd talked about this for years. They lived near each other in Greenwich. They'd gone plotting, walking around Greenwich Common, what they would do if they ever got it to the top. And now they finally get their chance. and they blow it. Talking to people involved, it was a sense of they were trying to get away with everything they could. So it's like, let's get the childcare reforms in. Can we talk anything about planning? We should have investment zones out to different free ports, all being added into this mini budget. And one of the defining moments of that was when they presented it as a rabbit out the hat, was the 45p tax cut.
But I'm not going to cut the additional rate of tax today, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to abolish it altogether. From April the 23rd...
The top rate of income tax at the 45% rate paid on any earnings over £150,000, that will be scrapped. A big tax cut for people who earn, let's be honest, a lot of money.
And
Yes.
this is obviously proved to be the politically most unpopular measure of the budget, but there were other things involved as well about, the energy price cap costs, etc. But the 45p tax cut really provoked a reaction, and one Tory MP was heard exclaiming "Jesus Christ" from the press gallery.
And you'd think that with a period of national mourning, there's lots of time to get this work done, almost under the cover of that, because it's not like you're having to be doing announcements and the usual business of public government during the day because of the impending funeral. But is there a sense that actually all of that actually threw things off course, and it meant that things couldn't happen as they normally would?
Yes. First of all, the Prime Minister herself was going around the country doing national church services in Scotland and Wales, accompanying the King, doing a lot of rigmarole, things that don't play to her natural strengths. She herself was quite distracted by that. Also, just the business of government was shaken. And I think perhaps also there was a mood. I remember going in that night, I think the day the Queen died, and seeing one of Truss's ministers was crying in the toilets of Parliament. They were just so upset. And people were really shaken. And Westminster, of course, is not just the political capital of the nation, it is the ceremonial heart. And there are so many people who are involved in some way with the monarch, and people were not, I don't think, prepared for the kind of shock or what the mini budget was going to be. And typically what happens is you get politicians who brief really hard, and then actually when they deliver something, it seems sensible and normal. This was the opposite. This was a sense of a country kind of feeling its way around how much this energy package is going to cost, getting over the Queen's death, and suddenly, bam, we're going to enter a cost of living crisis and cut the whole rate of tax. And so it was a real sense of shock, I think, and then the obvious market reaction to that, which played out, and not being in control of events was really a kind of sense I picked up around Westminster at that time.
Incredibly, if it wasn't incredible enough that you were able to interview Liz Truss shortly before she actually took office, the weekend after that budget, as all of this madness was happening, you had a chance to sit down with her again.
Yeah.
What on earth was she like there?
So we went and saw her the day after the mini budget on the Saturday, and it was surreal. So Harry and I were sitting outside Chevening because Chequers was being redone at that point, so outside Chevening again.
Harry Cole, political editor of The Sun.
Yeah, my co-author. And we suddenly see the gates open, and what on earth going on? And the Prime Minister was there with her family, and she was, I'm just off to go and get coffee. And it was just a surreal sight to see, given how, we had our phones up before us and could see what had been happening to the pound overnight.
Just looking at the pound, and it's ticking every second, and it's ticking lower. It is quite dramatic. That is a sign of investors out there being worried about sterling, and that's basically a proxy for saying them being worried about the UK economy and pulling money out.
And we then went and interviewed her, and she was just so calm. She was just very relaxed, and I don't think they were prepared for what happened, first of all, on the Sunday, when Kwarteng went out and said there was more to come.
There's more to come. We've only been here 19 days. I want to see over the next year people retain more of their income.
And thereafter, the reaction on the Monday in the Asian markets.
Dominic O'Connell, our business correspondent, is here. You're here a bit early, Dom. The news is so bad. What's going on?
Well, the pound fell to $1.03 in Asian markets overnight. That is the lowest it has been certainly since March 1985.
And was that confidence, do you think, down to a kind of delusion, or just a combative confidence that she could stay the course and this would turn out okay?
I think a bit of both. I think that we forget sometimes how cut off prime ministers can be at the top of government. And I think it really took a week or so, best part of a week, for it all to sink in just how badly it was going down. She'd been riding high, written off a lot in her career before. If you look at her episodes, she'd been mocked over things like the Port Market speech in 2014. Yeah. She'd been written off at the Treasury in 2017. Now she's the master of all she surveys. She's the Prime Minister. And it was a sense of, I think, or there's a lot of complaining and some jitters, etc., but we can ride out through this. And at that point, it wasn't immediately clear, but there was a sense perhaps that they weren't kind of across what the market reaction was going to be and the political reaction too.
At what point in the days after that do you think that the severity of it hit home? Because after that we had, well, the pound collapsing, poll ratings getting worse, that universally agreed disastrous round of BBC local radio interviews.
No one can deny you entered Downing Street with a difficult job on your hands, but you've made the situation worse so far, haven't you?
Since Friday, since your Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng's mini-budget, the pound has dropped to a record low. The IMF has said that you should reevaluate your policies, and the Bank of England has had to spend £65 billion to prop up the markets because of what they describe as a material risk. Where have you been?
What did people around her make of that round of interviews?
I think most of them would admit that Liz Truss has never been the most natural a communicator. And so it was more a case of just getting through them. But I do think there were questions to be asked there afterwards about the communications of all of this in terms of explaining the policy, how that had come across. And I know that she was pretty critical of Adam Jones, who was our Director of Communications, about that.
About the decision to do it?
Yeah, and so policy was pointing at comms already, and comms was blaming policy already.
James, we're powering through the 49 days of Liz Truss. We're on day 26 now. This is Sunday, the 2nd of October, for those with their diaries in front of them. Party conference. They all seem to have a brave face on them. But what was the mood like as she actually got to Birmingham for what should have been on paper a firming up on her position, a rousing call for the party to back her?
So I've been going to Conservative Party conferences for about 7 or 8 years, and this was exceptional. I think that there was a mood of sulphur in the air. It had been teed up, of course, by that Sunday interview she did on Laura Kuenssberg's show, and sitting just a few yards away was Michael Gove. And Kuenssberg turns to Gove after doing the interview and says, "Oh, Michael, what do you think of this?" And he just absolutely goes to town on her.
I think that there is an inadequate realisation at the top of government of the scale of change required. Using borrowed money to fund tax cuts. That is not Conservative.
Us hacks are arriving in Birmingham, and we're listening to all of this stuff, and already the scene is set. And I remember one farcical moment where Michael Gove basically was doing about 10 events. You know, he was definitely on manoeuvres at that conference, and he was speaking in one room. And I think next door was Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was in the government, the business secretary, and they were both criticising each other implicitly or explicitly, and journalists were reading out quotes. Or Michael says this about, and Jacob says this about, and it basically was a Tory party just tearing itself apart. So already the mood was very uncertain. And I remember going along to a midnight event with Penny Mordaunt, and everyone kind of had a sort of sense of black humour. And she said, "Well, what have we learnt from conference so far?"
What have we learned so far in conference? We've learned that our policies are great, but our comms is shit.
And there was then thereafter 10 seconds of laughter and whooping and clapping. This is Tory activists. But around that point, I was then invited up to, the party chairman has hosted these drinks every conference. And I was there having these drinks with half the cabinet was there, lots of spads, etc.
What kind of drinks?
Champagne.
Of course.
And I hear this commotion, and I go outside, and it's a proper back and forth along the corridor of the top floor of the Hyatt between my co-author, Harry, and Adam Jones, who's Director of Comms.
And this is sort of middle of the night or late
This is
evening?
20 past 12 on the first night of the Conservative Party conference. And the rumour going around, Liz had summoned Kwasi and said, "We've got to kill the 45p tax cut, got to get rid of it." And Harry's going, "We're going to run it now, unless you give me a denial on the record." "Oh, I can't possibly, all measures under consideration." He's sort of stumbling and umming and erring, quite robotic-like, and they sort of chase each other down the corridor to the lift. Adam tries to get in the lift. Harry's there trying to put his foot in the door. This is basically it for the government, because once the story goes, it's going to really kill the credibility. The doors close, Harry presses send and detonates the story. And one cabinet minister puts down their glass, says, "Thanks for that, you've ruined my conference," and walks off into the night. And that really set the stage for the next day when Kwarteng had to give the speech at conference. And it all went to pot, really, because at that point, they turned on one of the major measures.
Even the LGBT Tories at a disco turned on her.
Yeah, so The previous year, she'd been the toast of the evening. She had just been made Foreign Secretary, September 2021. She was dancing to Beyonce. Everyone loved it. That was when she considered being a real rising star and probably one of the next favourites to take over from Boris. And a year on, the final night, on the Tuesday night, Things Can Only Get Better came on, the new Labour anthem, and the whole club cheered, ironically. And one spad turned to me and went, "Things can only get better." And I'm like, no, they fucking won't. And they did not. And outside, I just saw, there was a group of Conservative MPs, and they opened up a copy of that day's first edition of Telegraph and just started laughing at a photo of Liz and that. It was really a sense of fatalism, defeat, and just black humour through it all.
The clock ticks on. Just over 10 days later, day 38, Friday the 14th of October. All those arguments about the dropping of the cut to the 45p tax rate continue, and suddenly the Chancellor is sacked. What was going on behind the scenes as that happened? Because it did seem to come like a bolt from the blue.
So I think, first of all, there was some residual anger over Kwarteng's comments about more to come, which were really unhelpful. The conference ends on the Wednesday. 2 days later, the OBR sends an email to the Treasury warning them of this huge 70 billion black hole.
Because of the tax cuts and spending promises.
Because of the and the energy price gap. And then at the beginning of the week, Kwarteng flies out to Washington to be at the IMF. And normally these things are just glad handling and etc. And this time it was a lot of interventions and being embarrassed by foreign ministers. But at home, on the Wednesday and Thursday, Truss was in meetings, and people around her in meetings with the top senior civil servants who are warning her. We are getting warnings that Britain's debt is about to start being handled as like a third world country. Well, credibility is going to be shot for 20, 30 years. We've got this black hole, 70 billion black hole. We've got to get rid of some of these tax cuts. The corporation tax cut was, I think, worth about 25 billion or so. That was then briefed that they were going to U-turn on that. And that dropped on the Wednesday papers, I think, for the Thursday morning. And as a result of that, they had to go along with it because the markets had then rallied on the back of that. And so they thought, well, if we deny that this is going to be happening, we therefore are going to lose all our credibility. And so they had to go along with the tax cuts. And once the tax cuts go, you think, you've got to get rid of the Chancellor.
How was that decision communicated?
So Kwarteng was summoned back, and he came back on the Friday morning. And there was a debate within his team, should he go back or not? One of his aides pointed out that there's only, I think, a couple of flights going out of DC. They'd have to tell the journalists they were with, and therefore the speculation would immediately start. Are they being summoned back to be sacked? And 6,000 people are tracking this flight, most of them all in Westminster. I think it's the world's most tracked flight at that point. He arrives back, touches down early Friday morning. And as he's driving back in his ministerial Jaguar, Steve Swinford from The Times tweets that he's to be sacked. And one of Kwarteng's spads hands the phone over to him, and there's a sort of pause of about a minute. And, well, that's that then. So he knows he's about to be sacked. He drives back up to Downing Street, goes in for a 20-minute long meeting with Liz Truss. And he points at, look, you get rid of me, they're going to come for you next. And she goes, Kwasi, they're already coming for me. And that ended a decade-long alliance. And there was this weird bit thereafter. I was talking to someone who said that and Kwarteng sort of hung around the building for a bit longer, trying to make small talk to people, and it was just really rather bizarre.
What, almost for like old time's sake?
Yeah, sort of, and just sort of what happens next. And I'm sure, as an economic historian, being sacked after less than 40 days would have really hit him hard. And I think it's perhaps noticeable that he's been more slightly forthcoming about the mistakes made in the interviews he's done since.
And I said, we should slow down. Slow down.
And what did she say?
And she said, well, I've only got 2 years. And I said, you'll have 2 months if you carry on like this. And that's, I'm afraid, what happened.
We then publicly had Liz Truss's explanation for this in a press conference.
Good afternoon. My conviction that this country needs to go for growth is rooted in my personal experience.
Which was notable because, well, it was very short.
Yeah,
and
8 minutes.
Yeah, and also there seemed to be lots of concern from some of the journalists there that she seemed a bit rattled.
Yes, it wasn't the most assured of media performances. She was meant to be there to explain what happened. I'm not sure how much you could really explain away, but also this is not a forum that's ever really appealed to her, I think with her is that it clearly had gone wrong. To her, the merits of tax cuts were self-evident, and she only gave 4 questions, and there were these kind of pauses in between where she was looking for who she should pick.
Harry Cole.
And so for people watching and for investors and people with mortgages, they were looking for reassurance. It was none of that. And the journalists walked away annoyed and baffled that they'd had so little time to actually question her.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Aren't you going to say sorry?
And that was, of course, a press conference on the day when she announced that Jeremy Hunt, a person she decried during the Tory leadership race, was going to be Kwarteng's replacement.
It lasted a few more days.
It lasted about, I think, 5 days from that.
So day 43 now, Wednesday, the 19th of October, the beginning of the collapse.
They had this war room going on in number 10, and they'd been really trying to just get through it day by day. But the Wednesday was when it all fell apart. There were kind of 3 incidents. The first of all, it started when the number 10 team really turned on each other, and that spilled out publicly. This was about a briefing that ended up in the Sunday Times describing Sajid Javid as shit. Well, that led to the suspension of one of her top aides, Jason Stein, and the finger of blame was pointed at one of his colleagues, Deputy Chief Staff reporter. So the number 10 team was feuding, and this was just 4 p.m. cues. That afternoon, Suella Braverman quits, sacked. It depends who you talk to about this incident, but really it was because she'd sent ministerial documents to an MP on a non-classified server, and there'd been tension behind the scenes for a long time before this. And so she then goes that afternoon, you think, my God, the Home Secretary's gone. Shortest serving Home Secretary since 1834. And then really this teases up for the main drama that evening.
This whole affair is inexcusable. It is a pitiful reflection on the Conservative Parliamentary Party at every level.
And Labour Party had an opposition day motion, very cleverly decided to do it about fracking. In a leadership race, Liz Truss said she'd lift the ban on fracking. The 2019 manifesto said we'd keep the ban on fracking. And so Tory MPs were caught between their manifesto and their leader. And it really led to MPs not being sure if it was a confidence vote or not. The Whip's office in absolute chaos. People in the voting lobbies, there were accusations of manhandling.
To all intents and purposes, one of them, to my mind anyway, this is what it looked like to me, was basically pushed or pulled through into the division lobby.
And the people weren't sure if the chief whip was in a job or not. And that was the night really she began to think about resignation.
And when you say confidence vote, that's important because it's if you vote against the government on this, you will lose the whip.
Yeah, lose the whip and bring down the government. And so people were then saying, if we lose the vote, do we have a general election?
And it's interesting that actually all these things on that day are sort of nothing really to do with all the drama we were talking about the tax-cutting agenda and the confidence in the markets. This was about briefings about who said what, about a minister. It's about the Home Secretary sending documents to someone that she might not have done, and a vote about fracking.
But also, a lot of this does come back to those assumptions baked in before she became Prime Minister. So Suella Braverman got the Home Secretaryship because she cut a deal in the leadership race. The number 10 team never got the jobs they properly wanted. It wasn't sorted out who was in charge in the hierarchy, so that was before she became Prime Minister. And the fracking vote also, I think, showed perhaps the wider tensions where she made a lot of promises during that race and how many of them were actually feasible. The Whip's office, she didn't get the person she wanted as Chief Whip. But you're right, and it comes down to basic questions around patience and temperament and credibility. Once the credibility was lost, her time was up.
And the fury from the Whips on this blew out publicly somewhat.
Yeah, she tried to sack Wendy Morton as Chief Whip. The Whip's office said, if you get rid of Wendy, we're all gone. And that was it. You can't function without a whole Whip's office.
Is it true that Craig Whittaker shouted, "I am fucking furious and I don't give a fuck anymore"?
I've heard it from onlookers, so I believe so.
So Liz Truss gets through this day, that was all one day, and returns to the flat. Do we know what's going through her head that
She's meant to have
evening?
a meeting with Jeremy Hunt to discuss the economic situation.
Of course.
And remember, of course, that economics is at the forefront of the mind because they've had all these warnings and they're really concerned about market credibility right now. She cancels that meeting, she goes upstairs, pulls out a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc and has a discussion with her husband, Hugh. They live up in the number 10 flat here and really sort of mulling it over. I think she spoke to a couple of aides and was discussing what the future situation would be. Overnight, Graham Brady, who's chairman of the 1922 committee, also gets a load of messages and saying that it's time to go. And the sort of convergence of what the party was saying with what the Prime Minister was thinking meant that she decided to go the next morning.
This is day 44. the 20th of October. Did she decide that morning, we think?
Yeah.
Yeah. What was the thinking behind her remarks?
I think it was very much meant to be a sort of contrast with someone like Theresa May, who obviously, when she quit, there were those tears welling up. And I think that Liz Truss has never been a publicly emotional sort of person. It really was just a very brief, minute and a half long statement.
We delivered on energy bills and on cutting national insurance. And we set out a vision for a low-tax, high-growth economy that would take advantage of the freedoms of Brexit. I recognise, though, given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party.
And she went so quickly that the markings on the floor from her original speech 6 weeks previously was still there when she came out to deliver that farewell speech.
Well, as in like the little bits of tape on this is where the podium should go.
You can see it, yeah. And so she quits on the Thursday, and then there's a leadership contest that weekend, and then she goes the following Tuesday. And really the last few days, it's just like a sort of a funereal atmosphere, really, where they're just doing the basic stuff.
But what does she do? What is the basic stuff?
So it's just writing thank you notes, handover notes from, a few weeks ago, these guys had just beaten the Rishi Sunak team. And now they've got to write notes saying good luck and all this kind of stuff. And so it was just things about, had a leaving party that weekend at Chequers, and they were saying their goodbyes, and it was just a few phone calls. A lot of the phone calls to world leaders had to be cancelled because, of course, why would you talk to someone who's leaving in 5 days' time? They had a final photo of the cabinet, and that was it. She then drove off into history, the shortest-serving Prime Minister, beating George Canning's record by 70 days.
Not in a ministerial car. That's the sort of final humiliation.
Well, this is the thing. She got an hour before an appointment with the King. They realised at that point, oh my gosh, because she's no longer a minister. So the ministerial cars and for her family were able to drive her there to the palace, but then alternative transport had to be arranged to take her back home thereafter.
Uber Lux.
Yeah. Well, it just shows you how 1 minute you're the Prime Minister of a nuclear power and the next you're a backbench MP heading back to Greenwich.
You'll have spoken to lots of people since who were close to the action as all of this fell apart and Liz just went off into the sunset. How do they reflect on what happened?
Most of them don't really want to talk about it.
Oh, I see.
I think that there's a sense of embarrassment. One of them I remember walking with on the day she resigned around St James's Park, and they said to me it was hubris followed by nemesis. And I think there is a sense of they got it wrong. I think everyone I've spoken to has regret about that and what went on. And actually, I think most of them are saying, how on earth could we have someone who we had such faith in? How did it end up so badly wrong? Liz Truss herself, I think, is interesting. She's been a bit less unapologetic.
I've had a lot of people get in touch with me saying, to varying degrees, what you were doing, you were trying to do the right thing.
A lot of her supporters think that she will ultimately be proven right in terms of her diagnosis, if not the way in which she went about administering the medicine. And I think that for now, perhaps the party isn't ready to have that conversation this side of an election, but it'll be interesting to see what happens in opposition.
I mean, as I ask this, I can already hear people with mortgages ripping their headphones off it in fury, but is it clear what her legacy is?
I think for her, the legacy will be what her successors do, which is that Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer now have both tried to define themselves against what she did, which is that boring is back, as Michael Gove said. People will not be able to, I think, try and operate in the way she did, and I think there was going to be a real sense of fiscal credibility being everything. Having seen that when you lose that, it's gone. People, I think the Treasury orthodoxy, I think, will be assured for the medium term. She will be in the next Parliament, and I think she'll be a voice in the next Parliament, and whether she'll be listened to or not is the key question.
You have been listening to Stories of Our Times, a podcast brought to you thanks to subscribers of The Times and The Sunday Times, with me, Luke Jones, and my guest political correspondent for The Spectator and co-author of Out of the Blue, the inside story of the unexpected rise and rapid fall of Liz Truss, James Heal. If you're a subscriber, you can read James's in-depth, day-by-day breakdown of Liz Truss's premiership's breakdown at thetimes.co.uk. The producer was Edward Drummond, the executive producer is Kate Ford, and sound design was by David Crackles. A lovely, glowing review will help other people find us, so do leave one wherever you're listening to this, and Man Veen will personally come and shake your hand. Goodbye.